So thank you very much for finding time.
Pleasure. My pleasure.
I was really looking forward to this.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
How did you hear about my work?
Well, it started when I came here. So because I live with John Diggins, he spoke a lot about you.
Oh, okay.
And actually, that was even before you had the second podcast at Joe Rogan's.
The Rogan podcast. Yeah.
He didn't tell me there's the first one. You sent it to me.
Oh yeah.
But then he
About the
basically martial
corrective
arts.
mechanism and
Yeah. And then when the second one came out, he showed it to me. I listened to it, and I was like, wow. Because for me, exposing things and questioning things and just kind of fighting the injustice of fallacy and just wrong thinking is very important. So I was like, whoa, this is so awesome. Cool. So I was looking forward. One of the things I wanted to ask is...
you can ask me anything you want.
Okay, awesome. Well, you're an expert in critical thinking.
Right. That's my area.
Which is incredible. I looked up at critical thinking so much, so to have an expert, it's awesome to be an expert in that.
I think part of the problem is that everybody thinks that they think critically.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody thinks that they're an expert critical thinker, when in fact it's a little more complicated.
How would you describe it? What makes the difference between a layman and a person who knows their stuff in critical thinking?
Great question. Attitude.
Okay.
It's an attitude and a disposition.
Somebody who's a good critical thinker is legitimately willing to revise their beliefs about something. Whereas sometimes our moral minds override our rational minds, so we latch on to an idea morally and we think the right thing to do is to believe that, and we're less likely to revise our beliefs if that's the case.
Right. So would you say that like a good critical thinker is one who's able to kind of start from a blank page, write everything off as soon as he understands that there's a fallacy there, or would that be a definition, or?
No, I think a good critical thinker, the American Philosophical Association's Delphi report laid out this whole thing, and it's a skill set and an attitude. Mm-hmm. And the skill set is, in my opinion, far less important than the attitude. Right. So the attitude is like being trustful of reason, being willing to revise your beliefs, being honest and facing your personal biases.
Yes.
And most people don't do that. They become wedded to some identitarian concern, like something to do with their identity or some moral idea, and then they just dig themselves deeper into the rabbit hole. They just go down and down and down. And then they have to, the farther they go down the rabbit hole, the more mental gymnastics they have to do to justify the beliefs that they have that are untethered to reality. We see that in the martial arts all the time.
Right.
You need these elaborate rituals and bowing and sense master and ancient guru, and it's all bullshit. It's all a way to make up the slack between the evidence that you have for a belief and the belief. And when the evidence you have for belief is out of alignment with the belief, you have to do something to make that up.
Right.
You get offended, yell at someone, punch somebody, have elaborate rituals set up. You have to do something to make up that slack.
Right. It can be very elaborate, actually.
Yeah.
One thing that really caught my eye and I resonated with in the paper you sent me, you mentioned the relationship between lack of critical thinking and kind of bad mentality, or I don't know how to exactly describe it, but also you're speaking specifically about martial arts. So to give a simple example, that if there's a lack of critical thinking in a given martial art, that it may eventually lead to a bad character, like a flawed person. Would that make sense to you? Do you think there's a relationship there, or is that?
So if somebody practices a martial art, a fantasy-based martial art, and I don't have the statistics of how many people practice these in relation to, because certainly MMA is ubiquitous now, and most people know that's just more effective. I mean, if you don't know that, then you really haven't been paying attention, or you're just the person down the street who wants to put their kid in a program, and you see a school and that's near your house, and you make the decision that way. But what happens again with that theme of if you practice a martial art, most people realize after years of practicing it, if they're honest, that's the attitude again, if they're honest and sincere, they realize that what they're doing, it won't work.
Right.
All this stuff about throwing, 5 guys with bats and knives, that's total bullshit, right?
Yeah.
So when those folks are honest with themselves, if they decide, they can make, it's a choice point, they can decide to forego the nonsense and do something that works, or do nothing at all, or to dig themselves deeper into this belief system that they have that their magic will somehow
Right.
knock the knives out of their hand. But in the price for doing that is you become an asshole. Right? You become somebody who wields that.
Like that itself is a type of attitude, because you know that doesn't work, that it won't achieve what you think it will achieve.
Or what you maybe you just tell other people, or
Right.
maybe you have a financial motivation to do it.
Right.
You have a studio, you have a lot of kids, and so there's an economic motivation to keep that
Right.
going.
Right.
So it's just a type of sincerity toward oneself, but lying to everybody else. So that's possible too.
What about a person who still believes that it's legit? Do you think that happens often enough, or you think there people are somewhere inside they know that this is bullshit?
Much less so now.
Okay. Right.
Because now we have ways to test those claims, and now
Right.
we know what works. There's only 5 things that work. We know what those are, and we know it doesn't work. But I don't have an axe to grind against something that I don't like. If someone thinks Aikido or what have you is great, and you pair them against a professional MMA guy and it works, then I'll adopt that technique. So I'm
Right.
not. There's no axe to grind against any of this stuff, but it has to be tested.
Right.
And it's the simplest thing in the world to test. It couldn't possibly be any easier.
Right.
Yeah.
But some people don't do that. In my experience, like I've been in Aikido for years.
Yeah.
It took me years to get to know that it's bullshit.
Yeah.
But I still have people coming at me saying that I'm wrong. I'm saying that right now. I'm publicly saying Aikido doesn't work. There's a lot of
course it
people,
doesn't, yeah.
right? But a lot of people don't get it. Like so that bias
And
is
that's
there. And
that's totally fine for them not to
Right.
get it. And so the response is, okay, maybe I'm wrong.
Right.
So that's the attitude of critical thinking. So you adopt the stance, well, you know what, maybe you're right.
okay.
Come on in, straight blast gym, here it is.
Right.
We'll start you up. You have a technique or whatever
Right.
you think you can't be taken down? Great, we'll give you 5 minutes with the wrestling coach. We'll see how that works. And if you're right, then I'll adopt that.
Right.
But I'm not wedded to. I'm totally open to change my mind, provided the evidence. You provide me
Right.
the evidence, I'll change my mind.
Right. And if they resist looking for evidence, like if they're,
Well, then,
as you mentioned, like
then they're not being honest with themselves because it costs nothing.
Right.
5 minutes of your time,
Right.
maybe 5 minutes to get dressed, and 5 minutes. So you're only talking about maybe gas money, but basically it costs nothing. It's negligible,
right,
and it can be tested. And the only reason they wouldn't want to test it is because if they already knew it wouldn't work.
right.
There's
I
no
think-
other reason to not test it, right?
Right. Because I think that's like probably like deep inside they know it doesn't work. But you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, they make these elaborate schemes of, for example, Aikido, it's the art of peace, so we cannot compete, or it's too deadly for MMA. That used to be a big kind of an excuse. So do you think there could be this kind of a complex structure in their mind created to not admit the truth? Do you notice that in
Well,
terms of critical
it's the
thinking?
same with anything. If you put time,
Right.
money, maybe blood, sweat, and tears into something, the longer you're invested in something, the less likely you are to forgo it and say it doesn't work.
Right.
But if you really are sincere about loving the truth,
Right.
then that won't be an issue for you.
Right.
But that's why the component to critical thinking is that you have to start with a form of honesty about it.
Right.
And I would say to every single person out there who's not willing to test it that they're not being honest with themselves.
Right.
And the sooner you can be honest with yourself, the more you can throw away superstition and become an adult. You
Right.
can let go of fairy tales and nonsense.
Right. Well, that kind of naturally leads to a next question, and for including martial arts, but also for any person, what should they look for when testing themselves, whether they have critical thinking or not? Like if a person is not sure if the critical thinking is legit, is up to good standards or not. You mentioned in the beginning, a lot of people think they have good critical thinking, but not everybody
It's
does.
a great question.
So what makes that difference? How can
It took me
someone?
a quarter of a century to figure out this that I'll give you in 60 seconds.
Awesome.
All you need to do is ask yourself one simple question. Under what conditions could my belief be false?
Okay.
That's it. It's the simplest thing in the world. I'll repeat that.
Yeah.
Under what conditions could my belief be false? So take, for example, martial art. I think, grabbing this way and, whatever. Under what conditions am I willing to admit that that's wrong? If the people can't even name the conditions under which it can be wrong,
Right.
then there's a good chance that something. Do you have the experience? Something's awry in Denmark. Like something's not quite right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So something's not quite right there. So it's more than likely at that point that they're holding that belief not on the basis of evidence, which is fine. We all hold non-beliefs on the basis of evidence, but you should be honest with yourself. Say, you know what? It makes me happy to think that this works.
Right.
I'm going to continue thinking that this works, but I'm not going to lie. Well, that would be a lie to myself, but I'm not going to lie. At the very least, okay, let's take a step back.
Yeah.
So it's called the feasibility. Under what conditions could these beliefs be false? So in the martial arts context, I believe I can, withstand a shoot from a wrestler. Okay, well, under what conditions could that be false? Well, it could be false if we test that with an actual wrestler, as opposed to me who never wrestled in my life. If you can name the conditions, then that's a step forward in critical thinking. And here's one more thing I'll say.
Yeah.
Even asking yourself that question can help you.
Right.
Because most people don't even ask themselves that question. They do exactly the opposite.
Right.
They say, well, what's the evidence? Well, my evidence is I've trusted 5 guys in the gym, they've grabbed me and I've thrown them.
Right.
And then that makes them more confident in their belief. But if you flip it around and you say, under what conditions could that be false?
Right.
It creates a wedge in cognitively in the way that you formulate your beliefs around a specific thing.
Right. Could you give some example, like in terms of martial arts, like in terms of what those conditions could be, like?
Will you give me a technique that works or something? Or?
Let's say a technique which is doubtful. What questions would you pose? Like, what would be those conditions?
Ground-based techniques or a fantasy technique?
Let's say it's fantasy. Let's say if you'd imagine yourself in a place of, well, my realm used to be Aikido. You probably saw a bunch of Aikido videos.
Yeah.
So somebody grabs, you kind of turn, and then the guy flies around.
Yeah.
But how would that questions, like what the conditions would be? Like what conditions would you say, like as an example?
And to that, you'd find somebody who comes from a legitimate school with a legitimate pedigree, and you don't have to start with black. You just start with purple belt. Someone approximately the same weight, roughly. I don't think gender matters that much. And then you just say, you know what? I'm going to see if I can throw you. So that's the condition under which the belief that if someone grabs me this way, I will toss them in the air could be false.
Right.
The other component is that you need is what Matt calls aliveness.
Right.
Timing, energy, motion.
Yep.
So the person has to be a resisting opponent. So the person doesn't want you to throw them.
Right.
So that's a condition under which it could be false. Or nobody could ever get me on the ground. Okay, so the belief no one could ever get me on the ground, how could that belief be shown to be false? Well, you could ask people who know how to take you to the ground to see if they can take you to the ground. And then what you do with everything else is you calibrate the confidence in your belief. Well, I walked into this MMA studio, 7 people with black belts tried to take me down, they couldn't take me down.
Right.
That doesn't mean there could be any number of reasons for that. It could be a shitty school, right? Who knows? Maybe who knows what the reason could be.
Right.
That's evidence of something. It doesn't mean the belief is true. It means you have to continue to test and refine it, and you calibrate your confidence along the way. Well, I was 70%. 7 black belts tried to throw me, they couldn't. Now I'm 85%. Now I'm going to go to another school and see what happens. Right. So it's a constant testing of yourself using reality-based physics and everything that we have in the world to test the beliefs that we have.
So in a way you find the places which are most questionable if it's a martial art, you find the places which are most questionable, and then you try to see them if it's really worth doubting or if it's actually legit. Kind of, would that be one way?
Yeah. Well, you just say under what conditions false. I believe this works. Well, let's test it, and we have overwhelming evidence. We have literally at this point tens of thousands of videos of people thinking they can throw people and them just getting the shit beaten on them.
So library's getting bigger.
And I mean, so the question would then be, this is the follow-up question.
Right.
Let's say that I have this belief, I've generated the conditions under which it could be false, I've tested it, and it turns out that I was wrong.
Right.
The real question is, am I going to continue to hold the belief?
Right.
That's the interesting question. The easy part is the defeasibility, like under what conditions could it go. The more difficult attitudinal part is, will I then change my mind?
Right.
And most people are surprisingly recalcitrant and will not change their mind.
Right.
Because of time, money, embarrassment,
Sure.
saving face.
Yeah.
But if you really want to be an adult and a real man, if you really want to man up, no one uses that expression anymore, but real adults change their mind in the face of evidence, and they say, you know what, I had this belief, I was wrong about this, I fucked up. To err is human.
Right.
That's what humanity is. It's a series of making mistakes and being mature enough to admit that I was wrong in those mistakes. Right. And it's humility, right? That
Right.
takes a certain humility. It takes
For
a
sure.
certain humility for you as a black belt
Right.
to go to the gym as a white belt,
Yeah.
right? And it takes a certain humility for me. I've been doing this a long time and I still suck. For people to toss me around like a rag doll, like John, just toss me around like a rag doll.
Yeah.
So,
So would that be kind of your suggestion, or I would say, I'm struggling sometimes with my English, sorry about that, kind of your suggestion to fantasy-based martial arts people, whatever you just said now, would that be your suggestion? Would that be your kind of wish to them, that they would?
no, my first wish to them is to be honest. You have to be honest with yourself.
Right.
Ask yourself, what am I doing this for? And if the sole answer to the question is community, I'm doing this because I like these guys, it's twice a week, we go here, afterward we have a few beers, eat pizza, great,
Right.
keep doing it. That's cool.
But
If your answer to that is, well, community is good, but I just get a great workout.
yeah.
I'm sweating like a dog at the end.
Right.
Okay, so you're honest with yourself.
Right.
I have no problem with that. Maybe if I can keep up, I'd love to participate in that too. Who wouldn't want a good workout?
Right.
But if the response to that question is that engaging in this behavior is going to increase the likelihood that I'll win a fight, you're fucking kidding yourself.
Yeah.
You're living a lie. So why don't you just be an adult and be honest with yourself
Yeah.
and test it out?
Right.
But don't bullshit yourself.
Right. Would you say?
Who do you think you're hurting when you lie to yourself? You're not hurting me. You're not hurting those kids over there. You're only hurting yourself.
You remind me of, I just recently learned this term, so I may mess it up, but it's kind of like I think it's called like a razor in a debate, like certain phrases which you rely on where you can see like, okay, this is becoming bullshit, I don't need to continue.
Occam's razor or something?
Yes, there's
Yeah.
I think like a few ones, a few, but so probably that's one. And one of them was if the other person is not basing their thoughts, arguments on evidence, then it's a no-go. Would you also adapt something like that? Because like in bullshit martial arts, what I oftentimes face is people telling me bullshit, but there's no evidence. They're like, oh, I know because I know.
So remember how you asked me what question, what do you have to say? And I said, well, then they have to ask. Okay, so then you have to ask those people, well, what is your condition under which you would revise that belief? And so this is important.
Yeah.
So they have a few options. There are only so many things someone can say to that. They can say, there are no conditions under which my belief would be false. Well, then it's a religious belief.
Yeah.
They're like a religious fundamentalist with this, and that's that. Or they can say, here are the conditions, and then you can test those conditions. Or they can say, I really don't know. And then you can work that out together. Well, what about, then you could provide it. Well, what about this? Well, and you could think it. But the point is that if someone says there is no evidence, then the response to that is, then that belief is not formed on the basis of evidence. Because by definition, to form a belief on the basis of evidence means, by definition, that there must be some evidence that comes in that would cause you to revise your beliefs.
Right.
But if there is no evidence, then your belief that you can toss around 10 dudes with knives is not based on evidence. And you can help someone be honest with themselves and say, well, then you really don't believe that on the basis of evidence. You don't even need a guy all you really need is like a 12-year-old with heart, and give him a magic marker.
Yeah.
And just see, and then have the other person go topless, and then see if they can, drew the black marks on the,
Right.
and they'll just be covered.
Yeah. Do you engage yourself in these debates, like both whether martial arts or just regular with people who just don't get it? Does that happen often in your life? I mean,
my whole life is that's my whole life. Every hour of every day.
right.
Yeah.
So
I don't know.
is it tiring and
No,
frustrating?
it is. I guess it's. I'm 52, and the older I get, the more I realize that we don't really choose the things we believe.
Okay.
So I can give you numerous examples of that, but even in this country in the last few years, attitudes have shifted dramatically about a wide range of things. But the one commonality, like a string through pearls, is that there'll be some widely held cultural belief, and then more likely than not, because it is a cultural belief, people will latch onto that and believe it. And with the gender, you mentioned the Rogan interview, and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and I did this gender studies project, the grievance studies project, and this is very complicated, but the as Christianity and Islam, the Abrahamic traditions fell, other things, Clay Rutledge and others have read about this, have like an increase in supernatural realm, entities populating the supernatural realm, that's increased.
Right.
And so
switching one for the other.
yeah, so people have called that the substitution hypothesis, that we need some kind of and James Lindsay has written about this in Ariel magazine, that the default for humans is just belief. We have to believe crazy shit, There's Michael Shermer calls it agenticity. There's agents everywhere controlling our fate, Illuminati,
Right.
like there's some secret cabal, the Jews, somebody's out there controlling the banks, someone's doing something. And then patternicity, and Shermer writes about that. We tend to see patterns and things. But the key to be aware of is that as long as you go back to that defeasibility question, under what conditions could this be false? And again, the example culturally is homosexuality. When I was a kid, the worst thing you could be called was a faggot.
Yeah.
Like that was gold star. Like if you lived in fear, and you can ask other people 52 if that's the case. In this country, at least I can't speak for other places.
No, it's my country is behind time, so it's more or less that is still more or less there, so I can resonate.
Yeah. Okay. So, but those beliefs weren't really chosen by anybody. They were enforced in society through shame, through stigma. There are mechanisms in place to keep those beliefs active, and always in your life, kind of as you go through your life, you talk about critical thinking and martial arts, and it's just the same question. And this is really kind of a heresy, but the question is not, well, what's your evidence for that? This is again what I've discovered after doing this, teaching and writing and reading this stuff for a quarter century. I always used to ask people, first question was, what's your evidence for that? I don't do that anymore. Total waste of time. In fact, it's the worst thing you could possibly do.
Right.
Because the moment you ask somebody for their evidence for something, this is what I learned from doing New Atheism for such a long time. Everybody believes that they have evidence for the things that they believe. Like you could find a Christian or someone, a Mormon, or whoever, well, Mormons consider themselves Christian or evangelical, but you could find anybody with any, wacky belief, and you can ask them what they believe and why they believe it, and they'll run down this litany of things, pun intended, and then they'll use that as evidence for what they believe. Right? So the things that they said, they're telling you, it's like every time you flip somebody with an Aikido black belt and you're an Aikido black belt, you become more and more convinced that those techniques work. Well, I just flipped 10 guys, I went to this gym, and I just flipped those 10 guys. But that's the wrong way to think about it, because you trap yourself in a state of delusion. And Feynman talks about the easiest person, the physicist Feynman, the easiest person to fool is yourself. And by asking those defeasibility questions first, someone believes they can do something, don't ask somebody what their evidence is. Someone believes guns, immigration, it's totally pointless. They already think they have sufficient evidence to warrant belief, that's why they believe it. Nobody will say, well, you know what, there's overwhelming evidence to believe this, I really wish I didn't believe this, but I'm going to believe it in spite of the fact that there's a mountain of evidence against it. You know, I've gone to the gym. I believe that if I did this wrist lock, I got the shit kicked out of me by 20 blue belts and 15 white belts in a row. I went to another gym, same thing happens. But you know what? I'm going to keep doing that because nobody says that. People don't live their lives like that. So instead, just immediately go to the question, how could that belief be false? What conditions would have to be in place, even hypothetically, for me to change my opinion about that? And if that's your go-to instantly about every question, you'll dig yourself out of cultural beliefs and kind of cognitive sinkholes that you wouldn't if you ask the question, what is my evidence for that? Because you just convince yourself that the evidence, that the data points you think you have constitute sufficient evidence to warrant belief in something. But you're just kidding yourself. You're lying to yourself. And the other piece of that, talking a ton today, the other piece of that is that we that's Matt's tattoo. Actually, have you seen Matt's tattoo?
I saw it, I never read it.
You should read it. It's a Bertrand Russell quotation. It's basically that we barter our will to believe for our wish to find out. You can read the actual quotation it's on, but the idea is that it's not about a will to believe something. Your wish to find out what's true should always supersede your will to believe.
Right.
So, in fancy terms, your epistemology should become before anything else. You should always ask yourself, how do I know this, and under what conditions could that be false?
Right.
It's just simple. It couldn't possibly be any simpler. It doesn't cost. It doesn't even take 15 seconds. You can literally say, okay, well, under what conditions am I willing to admit that this belief could be, that I could be believing something in error? Well, there are no conditions. Okay, well, then you don't believe it on the basis of evidence. You just choose to believe it for whatever other reason. Which is fine, but just be honest with yourself about it.
Right. Those debates, do you think, how useful do you think they are for the other person or for the whole? Like, because that's something I'm thinking about myself too. It's like a lot of people are criticizing me, believers, like fantasy-based martial arts believers, they criticize me, and I sometimes question, is it worth it? Should I debate with them, or is it better sometimes to just let them believe their own stuff?
They criticize you on the basis of what? For what?
I say that, for example, Aikido doesn't work. They say they have 10 different reasons.
Well, give me one. Give me three. What are the top three or the top five? Give me
let's say Jiu-Jitsu, they compare it to Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu is a sport, it's not self-defense, for example.
Okay.
What else is there?
But that's tested. Right. You can test that.
Right, but they don't.
Okay, that's tested. Okay, so the fact that they don't, they shouldn't be mad at you. They should say, I'm not being honest with myself. What's the second reason?
That it's me, that's my Aikido sucks. It's not Aikido that sucks, although I did it for
Okay, well then they can test their own Aikido. Again, so we got two questions. It comes back to them testing it. What's the third reason?
That it only works in the street. It's not meant to work against a professional fighter. I know. It's like, that's their excuse to not go to a jiu-jitsu gym or to an MMA gym and to test it. They're like, oh, it works.
So people, let me just want to make this clear.
Yeah, sure.
So people are upset with you, right?
Yeah.
So, do you know Plato's Republic? Have you heard of Plato's Republic?
No.
So, Plato was
I know Plato.
You know Plato? And
Yeah.
Socrates was a character in Plato's Socrates, or I don't know.
Yeah, well, and more or less.
So he has this thing called an allegory of the cave. You familiar with that?
Sounds familiar, but I need to
It's
realize.
a huge thing to unpack, but it's
Yeah.
a pivotal thought in the history of the Western intellectual tradition. Basically, Socrates describes a situation, an allegory, in which he's looking at the wall of a cave along with other people who are imprisoned, and behind them is a fire casting images, like a bear or whatever, and the people look at the images in the wall and they think that they're real, and they do this their whole lives. Now this is an allegory, right?
Sure.
So the people in the cave are us. Like we're walking flat, and we think that these things are real, but they're just shadows of a deeper reality, things that aren't true. But it's very interesting that in the Book 7 of the Republic, and Book 8, the allegory of the cave, Plato says that Socrates basically escapes the cave, and he decides that he's going to go back into the cave
To talk to people?
to talk to people, to try to free the other prisoners.
Yeah.
And he's very clear. He says if they could kill him, they would.
I mean, eventually they kind of do.
Yeah, eventually they do.
Yeah.
If they could kill him, they would. So of course, people aren't going to be happy with you because you've said shadows. These are just shadows. These aren't, and you've provided them with a way to figure out that they're shadows.
Right. Yeah.
So think about the intense dishonesty of somebody.
Sure.
The intense dishonesty.
Yeah.
To hold on to the belief that they can toss people around like a rag doll, toss a resisting opponent around.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah, and at some point, I'm not going to say they need psychiatric help, but no, but I mean, at some point there may be mental health issues for people who hold these beliefs.
Yeah.
Because think about this, because it really does take a certain sort of person who will tap so many times after so many years. And many people who still do fantasy-based martial arts are simply not willing to undergo that. Like when Matt is on top of you, I mean, it is just... Have you rolled with Matt yet? Okay. Yeah. But, it's like when someone is just sucking the breath and the life out of you, and you're just trying to hold on for dear life, it takes a certain kind of person to not tap under that. And maybe a lot of the folks who still continue to practice this simply don't have that disposition.
Right. Yeah. Would you say it's worth debating with them, nevertheless, or you think it's there's a line where you're like, this is not worth it? Because sometimes it's exhausting, but it doesn't go far.
I think if you want to help humanity, then yeah. I mean, I think what you're doing is a valuable service.
Okay. So it's worth engaging rather than...
I guess, what else so there's an opportunity cost. What else would you be doing? There's a question of how enraged will they be at you, right? So you deal with that. So the good thing is in that case, has anybody attacked you in real life? Okay,
not
so
yet.
so
hopefully
so
that doesn't
then
happen.
either they're not so enraged, or they know it in their heart that what they're doing is bullshit, and they won't attack you anyway. So that's an advantage.
Right.
But if there is always a value in the word iconoclast, breaking icons, but there's always a value in going back into the cave and showing people, hey, look, you believe the stuff that's not true, provided the person who goes back into the cave is willing to reconsider their beliefs. And as long as you're willing to reconsider your beliefs, as long as somebody says to you, hey man, I can fucking toss, I'm gonna, the first thing you should say is not, the first thing you say is, cool, awesome, let's test that.
Yeah.
And if you've got something cool that I don't know about that it works, I'm gonna put it in my game.
Sure.
So thank you for teaching me that. Thank you for coming. So that's bullshit, that won't work, but great, fantastic. Let's test that out and let's see. And I'd love to learn from you if that works.
Right. But the testing has to happen.
Well, yeah, or if it doesn't happen, why should you believe anybody?
Sure.
It's just make-believe land.
For sure. I think it's a little bit of a silly question, but I actually asked Matt that a while ago, and I'm very curious about your opinion. Do you think there will ever come a day where the majority of people will be good critical thinkers rather than the opposite? Because these days sometimes it looks like it's the opposite, like critical thinking is rare, like good critical thinking. Do you think that tipping point will ever happen, or what's your perspective about that?
That's a very interesting and difficult question. I think that we all, from evolution, we're predisposed to have biases in the way we think about something. And Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, talks about people act in some way because they're too morally motivated. And NYU's professor of sociology, Jonathan Haidt, in The Righteous Mind, says that morality binds and blinds. Morality binds and blinds. And the problem in a lot of critical thinking is that there are moral dimensions to these things. And as long as those moral dimensions. So think about it like this. Plato talks about a chariot. You know the word chariot?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, this is good. So it's like there's a horse, a lead horse, and then other horses on the chariot. Desire, appetitive stuff. As long as reason is the lead horse in the chariot, you're fine.
Right.
Right? So you want to make a decision, just make sure that take everything, emotions, feelings, also take everything into account, but just make sure that reason is leading you. And that again is where those questions of how could my belief be wrong, that's how you keep yourself in check.
Right. Yeah.
So reason is the main horse in the chariot. The problem is that we live in cultures that have different ideologies that are ascendant and descendant, different moralities, and we have all these competing ideas, especially with this in this global era of globalization and instantaneous technology, that make it incredibly difficult for us to overcome or even keep those biological impulses in check. Now we can go online and we can just Google anything we want to find and use that as a data point. Like, look, this is evidence for this, or this is evidence for this. Although increasingly, by the way, in Aikido and mixed martial arts, it's becoming more difficult to find anything that feeds the belief that if you do Aikido, you're going to beat an MMA guy.
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
so to answer your question directly, I don't think so. I think, as Martin Luther King said, Michael Shermer said, the moral arc does bend towards justice. I think things are getting better.
Right.
But whether or not, I don't, whether or not we'll all be this kind of ideal critical thinker, I doubt it. I doubt it, but I will say I think that the mechanisms, the tools that we have now for figuring out what's true and false are far better than they were before, but the number of people who have megaphones and the fake news, the disinformation is far greater. But that should call us to act, to place more importance on critical thinking, not less importance. So to answer your question directly, I don't know the answer to your question. My thinking would be probably not.
That kind of reminds me though of that phrase, whether it's Einstein or someone else, that if I don't know where the world would be if not for those few good people who are doing something good for it. So it's kind of reminding that there's always going to be evil, but if nobody does anything, then we're fucked. So I guess it's a little bit like that too. It's like there's never going to be a point where everyone is going to become a good critical thinker, but there has to be someone who's doing that. Otherwise, we're screwed.
Yeah, we can approximate that. Like we can keep getting closer and closer, but in my judgment, you can take this for what it's worth. The morality binds and blind. It's Jonathan Haidt again. It's the reason that we're not capable of thinking more critically and more clearly about something is almost always one of two things is operative. There's either a moral concern or an identitarian concern, and they can be both. You know, the trans issue is a great example of that. Race and IQ is a great example. All the things we can't talk about. The litany is long. You know, Peter Singer's example of what do we do with people who have IQs under 25. I mean, these are very, very complicated questions, and what we see now is the emergence of ideologues who with total certainty are completely convinced they have the answers to these moral questions. They couldn't possibly have the answers to moral questions because they can't present the feasibility conditions. They can't tell you how their beliefs could be wrong. So how could they possibly, they're just morally motivated ideologues. But it's very difficult when we're all swimming in this pond now, and it's so polarized. And one more thing, you know, James Lindsay says that each side views the other side not only as bad, but as an existential polarization. Like that if these people ascend, somehow that's a threat to our very existence. So that complicates critical thinking because you're then tossed into this soup in which we can't have conversations. Everybody's walking on eggshells. There are certain things you just can't discuss. You know, and I find that happening to me. There are just certain things I'm just simply not going to tweet or not going to wade into. I mean, why would I bother? I got so many people who hate me already. What's the point of it? Do I want to add like an extra, 20,000 in some fringe community? You know. But that's the good thing about martial arts is because it's so simple to test. It's so easy. Whereas figuring out complicated moral questions about migrant caravans or immigration, or, those things are much more difficult.
For sure. But it sounds like in your book it's worth doing. I mean, it's your job, it's your profession, but it's worth doing it, pushing the critical thinking, pushing evidence-based thinking to the majority.
Yeah, as long as you're cognizant of the fact that people will hate you, yeah.
That's kind of the price.
Yeah, and it's becoming increasingly nasty. You know, I mean, if you as though you rise up like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then all these women say, you know, the more your fame or popularity or followers or subscribers, or however, the more that grows, the more people will use whatever the zeitgeist is, the Me Too movement. I got a date with this guy, he raped me, or the more likely that those occurrences are.
Right.
You know, I had a meeting with this guy, I was just watching the series The Newsroom, wonderful series. I liked it anyway. But you know, there's a good. Have you seen the series?
Which one?
The Newsroom. It was on HBO.
No, what is it?
It's about a newsroom, and it took place a few years ago, and it was predated, so it's from, you know, I think the early 2000s. And it's a very snappy, witty dialogue of people who run a newsroom and their public perception of the media and how they're viewed and what ratings are. But the bottom line, if you haven't seen the example, it'll be lost. But the bottom line is that anytime you want to engage a controversial issue, you have to know that there's a price to be paid.
Right.
And now people can anonymously accuse you of anything, or they can, you know, there are prices to be paid because people don't like their sacred beliefs, you know, with in italics, their sacred beliefs to be criticized.
Sure.
And you're the guy walking in the cave pointing to the shadows and saying these are shadows.
Right.
So it depends what kind of life you want to lead, you know.
Right. Yeah. The very last question, to make sure we fit into time. Improving critical thinking. What would be the suggestion for anyone?
Ask yourself, under what conditions could these be false? This belief be false? Be honest with yourself. That's the first thing. The second thing is, don't hang out with only people who hold the beliefs that you hold. Listen to alternative, quote unquote, you know, listen to. I follow people on my Twitter feed who are conservative, who are liberal, who hold different beliefs, many of whom are friends of mine, so I follow out of obligation or because I just like them.
Yeah.
So find people who have different thoughts, find friends who have different thoughts. Be honest with yourself would be the third thing. Anytime lying to yourself is particularly toxic. Lying to other people is one thing, but lying to yourself is I mean, you're doing it's a manual consequence. It's a form of injustice towards yourself. And I think people can be unjust towards themselves.
Yeah.
And then the fourth thing is you just want to always, couple with that honesty and sincerity, is you don't want to assume that the person with whom you're speaking has bad intentions. And we do that so much in our culture. We just assume the other person's an asshole.
Right.
Well, he voted for Trump, he's a racist. Well, actually, no. You voted for Clinton, she's a, you know, whatever. Just really start with the assumption that the person with whom you're speaking is not an asshole. And that one little act of charity will go a long way in communications.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek first to understand, then be understood. Like really try to understand, and then ask questions. It's called Rappaport's rules. Like, is this what you mean? I just did this today. This is my wife. Like, she said something. It's like, you know, we had a little dispute. Is this what you mean? Is this what you mean? And she was really trying to understand. Rephrase what it is that they said to you in a way that it's Dan Dennett, the philosopher, says, it's so clear, I wish I had expressed it that way. And when you do that, that builds a lot of charity and goodwill. And it's very difficult to assume ill intent after you do that.
Yeah. So those 4. Got it. Cool. Well, that wraps up my questions. Would you like to make a summary, like a short summary of like what's the will be your main message?
The main message is be honest with yourself. Ask yourself how your beliefs could be wrong. Be willing, in the realm of martial arts, be willing to test those. Don't do any bullshit like, oh, this is too deadly. You know it's not too deadly. That's bullshit. That's a way to be dishonest with yourself. Don't be dishonest with yourself. And again, maybe you're just you have, you know, a lot of people have claustrophobia, they just can't deal. That's fine. Just be honest with yourself about it. Don't lie to yourself. I have claustrophobia, I'm another dude on top of me creeps me out. I just can't do it. Great. Thank you.
honesty.
You're honest
Yeah.
with yourself.
Right.
But the main deliverable is always ask yourself that question: how could my belief be wrong? And if it's shown wrong, am I willing to change my mind about it?
Right. Cool. Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.